Okay, welcome to Reconceiving Conservation, a Sustainability Learning Center Lunch and Learn, and welcome to our special guest, Ed Quevedo. I still got it wrong, Ed. I'm sorry.
No worries. No worries.
Yeah. Anyway, so just quickly, I'm going to take 1 minute to just remind everyone the Sustainability Learning Center is a learning and networking hub for sustainability. We provide professional development and skill certification on sustainability core competencies. And our mission is to equip people with the skills and knowledge to create an environmentally sustainable and socially responsible world. And we provide lunch and learns, face-to-face and online instructor-led training, as well as lunch and learns, skills certification, and we are working with the International Society of Sustainability Professionals and Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, Natural Step, and others, and we'll be in partnership with, we also have a partnership with Green Education Online to provide 51 e-learning modules, and it's a platform that provides really foundational understanding on everything from water conservation to sustainable supply chains. And then we also have our Sustainability Learning Network. This is free to sign on, and there's a number of webinars and these lunch and learns on the back end of our website. So this is, you would sign on to our website, and then you'd see this login in the right-hand upper corner, and you can log in for free, and there's all kinds of past webinars there. And then some of the upcoming programs that we have coming in September, some of the live online ones, including the Green Team Gap Assessment Program, our Project Management Program, which starts in October, and Ed's going to talk a little bit about how we're going to do a more in-depth Reconceiving Conservation course after we do a couple of free webinars. And then we're doing on-site in Toronto at Evergreen Brickworks, Sustainable Procurement Program, as well as a Life Cycle Assessment Program, which we do annually in November. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Ed Quevedo. And Ed, I'm just so excited that you're here with us today. You and I have been talking for a few months now on this topic. And Ed's going to challenge us to step away from our kind of reductionist worldview and reimagine how we can make the concept of conservation fresh and forward-thinking. So he is an assistant professor of sustainable enterprise with Mills College Lokey Graduate School of Business, and he serves as the lead faculty in concentration on socially responsible business, and he's also a research fellow at Mills Center for Socially Responsible Business. He was previously at the faculty at Presidio Graduate School, where he taught the capstone social entrepreneurship course in the MBA program, and he's lectured on environmental management, applied ethics, sustainable development, and sustainable business practices at various universities: University of California, Tulane University, the Technical University of Berlin, and Lund University. And Ed's teaching is informed by his work in sustainability law, policy, and management consulting. And since 1994, he's advised large, medium-sized, and startup companies throughout Europe, the Americas, and Asia on sustainability management, corporate responsibility, environmental health and safety, legal compliance, and change management strategies. He also has 20 years of public agency practice experience devising community development and land management strategies for sustainable development in communities such as Calgary, Alberta, in Bavaria, at Fort Mills in Colorado, Sonoma County in California, in New York State, as well as in California. So Ed, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Catherine. It's good to be with you all today, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. I want to first, though, give credit to the remarkable organizations and really brilliant colleagues that I've worked with over the years. Most of these ideas are a derivative of the work of others, and so mistakes here are mine, but if there's anything good, it's probably the result of filtering good ideas from really talented people around the world through the sieve of experience. And, you know, our objective here is to, as Catherine said, be bold and provocative and hopefully inspire conversation about this topic during the 3 breaks we're going to take in the delivery. And I'd love it if you could unmute yourselves, and if we could have a live conversation, or if it's easier to use the chat for you, given your circumstances, that's fine. I want to center us a little bit on this idea of genius loci, if I could, which comes through my learning from a brilliant landscape level architect named John Tillman Lyle, who taught at one of our institutes of learning here in California. He talks about spirit of place, or genius loci, as being the sort of, if you will, if you think about the metaphor to wine, the terroir, or the flavor out of which the land and the people on a piece of land are born. And I start there because I found this beautiful building, which is called, Catherine, the Sustainability Learning Center, spelled C-E-N-T-R-E. But this one happens to be in Mount Nelson, Tasmania. And they teach various courses to school students from kindergarten through PhD seminars here in the Sustainability Learning Center. So it's interesting that spirit of place and these kinds of ideas are really a global phenomenon, as are the problems that we're going to be talking about in this discussion today. So as I go, please don't feel like you need to wait until I take a break for formal questions. If you want to jump in with a question and unmute yourself, the livelier the better, I think, and the more useful the time will be. You can look at this slide at your leisure. I'm not going to tarry over it, but this is essentially the way that we're laying out the 2 webinars on a very broad topic. The goal today is simply to set the landscape for a set of challenging and hopefully helpful ideas. And then ultimately in webinar 2, we'll talk about 2 cases, 2 applications of this approach to reconceiving community conservation. One on the U.S. island of Kauai, and the other down on the Front Range in Fort Collins. We will move on. So in 1972, as many of us may have forgotten, the world convened in Stockholm at what was called the Stockholm Conference, during which, for the very first time, the global business and government communities considered the question of whether an economic development was always going to be coextensive with ecological destruction and decline. And out of that meeting came a phrase that has been part of the Agenda 21 process in Rio 1. It was part of the WSSD meetings in 2002 in Johannesburg. It was very much resonant in the UN's Rio 2 conference in the summer of 2012. The fundamental distilled essence, I think, of sustainability, which is the mandate to humankind to change unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. And I'm going to argue here that this is important because the model for how we produce and consume begins with how we design our communities and our cities. Every company of any size, big, adversely impacting extractive firms like Anglo-American, large global software firms, the biggest car companies in the world, they all began with a person going to a town hall and getting a business license. And that interface between commerce and community is what we're going to explore, and I would argue strongly that the reason we've made extraordinarily little progress against changing unsustainable patterns of production and consumption is because we have not properly conceived how community development works and the relationship between community and nature. So, we've got this little idea that the very happy consumer economy we have provides goods and services. And at a community level, if we do good economic development, we'll have jobs. And that gives us healthy communities and happy people. And this is how community development architecture, reduced to a simple kind of horsey-ducky model for purposes of efficiency, works both by law and practice globally. The problem is this model is fundamentally wrong. It's dramatically incomplete. And as you'll see, if you decide to take the online course, we're going to talk about the dramatic failures of macroeconomic theory to explain that bottom box accurately. in terms of the relationship of nature to community. An alternate way of thinking about it is a more holistic or systems level approach, whereby healthy ecosystems, beginning with healthy soil, drive a healthy and conservation-based rather than consumption-based economy, which then gives rise to healthy communities of people and the other creatures that we have the privilege of sharing the planet with. I think it's important to think about the fact that our responsibility to build healthy communities depends on our ability to conceive of those communities as being healthy for not just humans, but other participants in the ecosystem. And we can debate and talk about that. And I am trying to be a bit provocative here to get you guys out of your chairs and hopefully discussing these ideas as we go. So when I was putting this presentation together, I was trying to make a pie coextensive with trying to think of how this was going to work in this discussion. The practice of making a pie crust from scratch at home, there may be very many talented bakers on the line, but for me, I find it hard, messy, and complex. And I think that urban planning is largely a failure. If we look at sprawl, if we look at the dramatic backbreaking divide between the rich and poor, if we see how this is magnified in how we set up our towns and cities, and if we see that there is a dramatic divide between technical urban planning and holistic community development, we can say perhaps that we usually get it wrong. I have often been asked to join community development projects that have gone terribly wrong because they've used the concept of charrettes and stakeholders and engagement models and flip charts and voting with dots and other horrifying ways to spend a Saturday afternoon. And the planning process is rather like this little note here from a place called despair.com. Problematic at best. And many of you are professionals in this domain, and I think people who work at the local level in community development get neither the credit nor the recognition they deserve, and it's hard work, but often the odds are stacked against us by the models that we use. So I'd like to engage in a bit of a discussion here to see if you disagree or agree or have other views about this notion that I'm advancing here, that we've actually got this quite wrong for the most part, and that we can do much better. So I'll invite questions, either in the chat or live from you.
So I see that Chris Winter is asking you, Ed, can you give your definition of conservation? And do you make a distinction with sustainability or green, or do you consider them essentially synonymous?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I would offer the following country lawyer account of this, because I am still trying to sort what I think about this. But I'll tell you, the roots of my concept of conservation come from the work of Aldo Leopold and seeing the work of Aldo Leopold on the land. And then there's a gentleman named Alan Savory, who's a diplomat, a politician, a conservationist, and a scientist, who's done work in the American West to demonstrate conservation techniques that go back to Aldo Leopold. And essentially, I think it means living in harmony with the land in such a way as that we can effectively connect community to land, reclaiming our commitment to the general welfare, the common good, and the public interest through thinking about preserving the health of the land for future generations. So I think concepts like green and sustainability are parasitic on a broad systems level definition of conservation, but I could be wrong about the definition. I would welcome, challenges or other definitions. I just think too often our idea of conservation is about sacrifice and limitations and minimalism, which is kind of where this conversation between Catherine and I began. And when we fully display this approach that we've used in communities, both in webinar 2 and in the online course, you'll see that we try to flip the poverty-stricken sacrifice concept of conservation on its head and work from nature's model, which is one of abundance. But we can only create abundance through disciplined conservation of the systems that support life. So I'm sorry, Chris, if that's a long-winded answer, but there it is. And again, I'd welcome other thoughts.
Just as Chris is letting that sink in, and do feel free, everyone, to unmute yourself or raise your hand and then unmute yourself, because Ed's being provocative. You know, he's used some words, and for some of you who are sitting in your chairs right now who are actual planners or directors of planning, you know, you may feel a little uncomfortable with some of his language. So feel free to challenge him, because that's the reason that he's doing it. Katie or Matt or Tony, you guys, I don't know, your toes may be curling a little bit. I don't know if you'd just like to unmute yourself just for a moment and just kind of test. Chris, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, indeed. Parasitic, that's a very challenging term, I guess. It's one I've never used about how sustainability or green has built on conservation. But it is pretty much a growth or a trend that we always seem to reinvent the wheel every decade or so, and usually with a new term, new jargon, so that we all can get on the bandwagon again. And in fact, when you look at sustainable development, it actually did grow out of the work on the conservative society of the previous decade and before that. So in reality, I totally agree with you, Edward, that that the terms are relatively synonymous, and they all hark back to living in harmony with nature. The thing that I've found is that it's more about how do we market living in harmony with nature, and that sense of abundance, and that conserving or living a conservative lifestyle is not a negative thing, not a sacrifice, but is actually a way to live better. Yeah. And that, to me, is the real challenge that we face now going forward. Is it doesn't matter whether you call it conserving, living green, or living sustainably. The key thing we have to do is to focus our efforts on how do we make it easy, affordable, and above all, desirable to live that conservative lifestyle. Whether it's community design, energy efficiency, transportation alternatives, it's all about making that lifestyle desirable. So the way I summarize it is conservation is about using less and living better.
I think that's really insightful, Chris, and the metaphor that I would use is to eating healthy food. You know, it is very easy these days, especially in the developed world, to eat cheap, nutritionally limited, and actually physically harmful food in great quantities. If you compare such a meal with a responsibly raised, fields close to table meal, it's incalculably better from every standpoint, from the social dimension of the food to the nutritional value. That the responsibly raised meal is better. It is absolutely about marketing. And I find we're doing a project right now sort of cleaning up after a rather messy community development process in a town in Montana. And people were completely uninspired, and their spirit and hope was crushed by a set of charrettes and stakeholder engagement activities that were all about navigating towards consensus, but really it was about trying to create economic development for a few developers who wanted to do some things in the town. But I think the marketing of conservation as an inspiring idea requires inspiration. It requires an approach that it ennobles people and calls them to remember that they're in the room to plan the community for their children and to take responsibility for their community because their ancestors are watching how they're going to be stewards. And I think the relationship with the concept of conservation, well considered, and stewardship is essential in creating inspirational models of action rather than sort of soul-numbing charrettes. But we'll dive more into that. And before I go on, I just want to say, see if anybody else has any thoughts on this, because I have plenty more slides, and we're going to try to get even more provocative about these ideas as we go.
Yeah, I'm just going to make one comment and then point out something Lori said, and then I think we probably have to move on. But I even wonder whether or not we can get to that inspirational piece, whether if we have not first looked at our unexamined assumptions and kind of tested and played with those a little bit, so that people can move on to that inspirational piece. Lori was saying, unfortunately, most sustainable mixed-use developments price price is out of the range for most residents to benefit from.
Yeah, it's a great point. I have been studying community development models that break that mold, Lori, and I am very impressed, for example, by what's going on in a development called Prairie Crossing in Illinois. Prairie Crossing was designed on Aldo Leopold's model of landscape level conservation. I may be able to advert to it in the online course where we have more time. But you're absolutely right. Too much of the sustainability focused goods and services on the market, from food and clothes to housing, is priced to worsen the pathogenic divide between the rich and the poor. And we have to call it what it is. It is pathogenic. And the only way we can get it right is by shifting our focus and trying to think at system level and multi-generationally to do the work fundamentally of social justice. I think we have to call it that. So I'm just going to lay out, a few community development models I've worked under. As Catherine mentioned, I have the burden of being a practicing lawyer, and I'm admitted to practice in a few places. And I've worked in the east of Canada under the Greenbelt Act and the marvelously named, almost poetically written Places to Grow Act. I wish we had a statute like that here in the States. I have a typo to confess here on the next one. Our poor friends in BC will be shocked to see how wrong I got this, but I'm really referring there to official community plans, or OCPs, under the Local Government Act in BC. And then in California, we have the General Plan Law, which I'm going to quote to you. And, we would recognize this language as practitioners of the craft of sustainable development. The general plan is what we use as the architecture for a community to plan its future here in California. The general plan law says that the general plan should identify the community's environmental, economic, and social goals and policies as they relate to land use and development. Well, that sounds promising. Since it affects the welfare of current and future generations, it should take a long-term perspective. Well, that's groovy. It'd be nice if it did. And, the general plan is supposed to underlie land use decisions. However, very often, it just doesn't. And so we get urban blight, that's Los Angeles and Detroit, respectively. It's an interesting idea. Chris mentions an idea of an urban village. That term is being used, Chris, and others, in a town near here. I sit today here in the hills of Oakland. But down in San Jose, there's a community plan developing. We've been asked to advise on the development of an urban village, which is an off-grid planned use development for 200 people that will be self-sufficient from an energy and water standpoint. This practice began in Holland, as many good things do. And they began, just as you adverted to earlier, by a marketing campaign and an education program to get citizens to appreciate the value of such a community. And I think the market spoke loudly. Half of the units were bought by speculators, the other half were bought by low and middle income people, because the unit, the beauty of this village was it was planned for teachers and police and other first responder communities who have a relatively low income in one of the most expensive places in the U.S. here in the Bay Area. So it is a question what an urban village is, and I think it's a very useful idea. It's also useful to think about it because we make a mistake when we artificially talk about the urban wilderness divide. It's a continuum, it's not a divide, and I think that's what gets our planning on the wrong track quite often. The thing that I've observed is that much community development and much urban planning is driven by this engine of economic development, which is important. However, I would go back to the model that I adverted to earlier, the broken model of assuming that the material economy, through creating goods and services, drives jobs and therefore happy people. I would ask you, how many people do you know who make a good living but are miserable in their work? I can tell you that most of the lawyers in the world fit that description, I'm afraid. And we have a pace of work here in in the U.S. and in Silicon Valley in particular that is crushing to quality of life and balance. It tears families apart. And for what? And I will mention something here that we're going to get into some depth in the online course. The relationship between these ideas about conservation and land use planning done responsibly and ethically and in an inspiring way, and the global movement towards development of indicators of well-being at community level, or what, for example, the city of Santa Monica calls happiness indicators. Interesting point, Chris. Dream homes are those homes that have 3 people in them, but number about 5,000 square feet or more. It's more like nightmare homes, I think, when you think about the real cost. So I want to challenge this idea of community development being predicated on economic development, because in community after community, we were doing a project last year up in the Front Range in a town near Fort Collins, in Greeley. I don't know how many of you have been to Greeley, Colorado, but it's a cattle town, and it smells like it. But it's also a university town. The University of Northern Colorado is there. And we dove into this economic development process, and I saw what I've seen a few dozen times, which is people talking about jobs, 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 as if every job were equal. And in my work advising graduate students here at the university, and I think out in the world, we need to recognize that there's a progression from job, which is what you have in high school, so you can buy yourself, you know, some entertainment, careers, which is what you have when you're out of college or graduate school, and callings, which is how you find your purpose in life. And I have yet to see, except for the few exceptions that I'll mention when we get to the cases, economic development or those who are interested in making money off of economic development give a care about callings, people finding meaning and inspiration in their work, and not just a living wage. You know, and we have this quantity consumptive attitude about jobs in the same way that we buy endless mountains of stuff for our homes, so much so that the second largest growing business sector in the development community is places to store stuff that we don't have room for in our homes, which is a little bit nutty. So I would argue that the retail sales model at the root of economic development is broken, because for the most part, I would welcome you guys to challenge this. Retail sales jobs are pretty uninspiring, although they're great jobs at the beginning of one's career. But how do we convert those into meaningful work? And I would propose that the seeds of the collapse we're seeing around us exists in our picture of the consumer economy, which in turn, I will argue, again, in part to be provocative and in part because I think it's potentially true, that the consumer economy is broken because we misconceive macroeconomic theory. I'd like to pause again here to drink some tea and to let us discuss a bit this issue about micro to macro. This is a map of creation of a thriving community that came out of a convening we did in Fort Collins, a case we'll talk about next time. It's a lovely piece of work, and you'll notice the word in the middle of the map. It's a 3-letter word, fun. This work has to be inspirational. It has to be fun. You have to create a mood. You have to create a mood in the room that makes people say to their friends and loved ones, you've got to come back to the second convening, because there's something happening here that matters. And it gives me chills to think about. And this is the work. This is the way that this work can be done, and too often it's done, as I said, with flip charts and less inspirationally. The reason I want to go to this macro to micro, or flip it on its head, is to go back to that slide that I used earlier to explain or to argue, you know, that our, you know, essential economic model is flawed because we don't really understand the gearing of communities. This one here. So this one goes from micro to macro. If we have good jobs and a good consumer economy, well, that leads inevitably to happy people. And I would argue the evidence is dramatically to the contrary. But I'd love to invite you guys to disagree or give your thoughts about this before we press on.
Well, I was just going to, I'm looking at what Chris and Rob are talking about, and I'd love both of them to jump up in here because they're talking about the need for citizens, because we should stop calling them consumers, please, saying that they want change. And that always goes back to what's the point of pain. And I wonder if we've gotten used to the pain. We're used to the pain of commuting and used to the pain of living in our homes because there's no place to walk or bike, or used to the pain of driving our kids around. Like, how do we make people understand that the pain that they're used to is not reasonable and that there is a better way? And Chris and Rob, you guys were talking a little bit. Lori, you were talking about the fun. Please either raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'd love somebody to jump in.
I'll jump in. It's Chris.
Okay.
I think there's been a traditional approach in the environmental movement of lobbying for change, for policy change based on guilt, pain, and death and destruction. That we talk about, the pollution, the environmental collapse, the global warming, you name it, pick your poison. And because of this, we need people to sign our petitions and to lobby for policy that will save the world. And it works maybe for a while. It works on a little individual battle, but we're losing the overall campaign, the overall war. And that's why we need to change to something along the lines, I think, what Edward was saying, that at the heart of it, it has to be something people want. We want this change. So it's not enough to say we need alternatives to gridlock, and we need transportation and subways. It has to be people saying, I want to ride my bike, and I want safe bike lanes so that I can ride my bike, or I want to be able to feel comfortable taking a bus, or I want to live in a walkable community. So that politicians see the demand is not some third-party demand or some arm's length demand. It is visceral. It is something that they want themselves. And politicians respond better to that. So we're building a stronger mandate by marketing, through positive social marketing, that leads to the policy and the incentives and the support programs that help make it easier for us to live the way we want to live. The more easier it is, the more people will do it, and that's the reinforcing loop that we need to start developing. And it doesn't matter what the issue is. There's a reason why we want to do it, for whether it's energy, transportation, or whatever.
This is really good stuff, Chris. And none of this says anything yet about the urban core, right? I mean, you know this. There are neighborhoods in Toronto that I've been to that are very like neighborhoods in Detroit. There is this concept I'll get to called radical transactiveness, the work of the scholar Stuart Hart, that we've used to get people into the community development process who've never been heard. In California, I'm of Mexican and Native American descent, and I've yet to be to a town to do a community planning process where they effectively engage the immigrants or the urban poor, and you must. The second thing I'll say, it's about that idea of genius loci. We went into a community that I won't mention because it was really quite bad. The urban community, the urban planning process got so bad that everybody was suing each other. And we were called in not just as conveners and facilitators, but in our capacity as attorneys to fix this. And the first meeting we had, the stakes were really quite high for this community. So I really thought about design, and I thought about mood and place. We held our first meeting in a church. It was a Unitarian church because I felt that would be as sort of broadly non-denominational as we could be. It was a beautiful place with a great spirit and feeling to it. And we made sure that key people in the community brought their children. And the mood of the meeting, everybody said, was totally different to the conference rooms populated by angry, interested stakeholders who were fighting with each other. And often we dismiss these ideas of how we structure meetings, where we hold them, whether children are in the room. Another time when we did this project in Capitola, when we presented on this urban planning process, so I can talk about it, the process was really quite breaking down. So in a slide deck that I was using to explain the idea of Reconceiving Conservation, I inserted pictures of the grandchildren of some of the town council members. And it totally changed the mood of the discussion. And sometimes we forget what we're doing this for. And I think that's the beauty of what Aldo Leopold and others have said about this idea of how ecosystems relate to community development. And so, you know, I would argue that we have largely alienated ourselves from the environment in these windowless, soulless conference rooms where we do much of this work. And we've made the environment the other and forgotten about ecology. And the fact that, again, I would argue, and there's people on our economics faculty here at the university who think I'm a bit of a problem because I make these kinds of statements, but look, guys, the material economy is based on ecosystems, whether we like to admit it, remember it, or not. And if we crush those ecosystems, our material economy and our arrogance about the solutions provided by technology will be our very end. So, you know, I think we need to reconceive our idea of community development starting at the rootstock. And, you know, this picture here is meant to typify a process, which is to say that if we don't start at the beginning, we're going to get it wrong. Somebody built what looks to be a very expensive building here, and there's a terrace that doesn't really seem to lead anywhere. And to me, this is a visual representation of what a lot of community planning tends to look like. The mind map, Lori, that was in there is in the slide deck, and I'm going to use a bigger version of it when we get to the online course. But you're welcome to take the slide out of there and use it. Here's the thing. I mean, often these mapping artists are the critical linchpin, much more important than anything we say in these convenings, because this beautiful visual representation, again, helps to set mood. I want to go back to a different kind of rootstock here, and this is the rootstock of sustainable development. At the same time that the Stockholm conference was going on, the first UN convened global meeting on the issue of sustainable development. Donella Meadows and her research team at MIT were responding to a RFP from the Club of Rome, the titans of industry at the time. The Club of Rome ultimately became the World Economic Forum. And they wrote about a computer model they developed to compare extrapolated rates of consumption of natural resources to feed the material economy and what would happen over time. And in this book, Limits to Growth, they wrote in 1972 that based on the available data and the computer model, we conclude that growth in the harvest of renewable resources, depletion of non-renewables, and the filling of sinks are combining slowly and inexorably to raise the amount of energy and capital required to sustain the quantity and quality of material flows required by the economy. Remember, this is 1972. They continued that eventually this demand for resources will be high enough that growth in industry can no longer be sustained without unreasonable strains on natural systems and very creative, potentially dangerous, and likely artificial manipulation of capital markets. When these come to pass, the positive feedback loop that produced expansion in the material economy will reverse, and the economy will begin to contract. And so you could sort of say maybe they were onto something back in 1972. The Millennium Ecological Assessment, published in 2006, which we'll talk about in the online course, documents the condition of the 25 macro ecosystems that support life on Earth. And as you may know, it quite compellingly argues that half of them are in decline and a quarter of them are irreparably lost, including fisheries, because of the consumption at the root of that broken economic model, those little triangles. A leading diplomat and politician argued in 1972 in the face of Donella Meadows' book that we are unprepared to accept. And I would argue we still are, some 40 plus years later. And so we sit in these rooms and we break up into interests and sectors. People don't speak the truth about what their agendas or their resentments are. And it's not surprising that we get it wrong when we try to do community development against this context, as though interest groups and voting was a way to think about conserving the ecosystems that support life, rather than trying to think high-mindedly long-term and being bold in the face of rebuilding a material economy that right now is really, in many ways, creating strains on people first, and then on the ecology around us. that are intolerable. I mean, the rate at which people work, the conditions under which they work, granted, it's really quite horrific in the developing world, but if some of you have seen how people work in food processing facilities in the American South, or in fabric sewing facilities in New York City, it's really quite shocking that we let this stuff go on in the name of community development and building jobs. And these cruel exclusions, I think, can be solved to some extent by this idea that I mentioned earlier, bringing fringe stakeholders with radically differing views into the discussion. I cannot tell you how many times I've sat with professional staff and town councilors and members of city councils who are planning workshops on community development, and they say, oh, well, people from that neighborhood or that group, we need to make sure they're not there because they'll create a problem. When a family acts that way, you get deep dysfunctionality. When a community acts that way, it's really a breach of the public trust. And it's easy for me to say. I've never been an elected official, but I do take this work quite seriously. And this work really requires a rethinking about how we do inclusion. It's not about stakeholders. I think the stakeholder concept has outlived its purpose. This is about citizenship. And having a social conscience that says the people with the weakest voice and the most fringe perspective have to be part of the process, or else, we run the risk of getting it wrong. I'd like to pause again here. Some of you, let's see, Catherine and Lori may remember I used this three-letter acronym, WTB, in Chicago. You're confronted with all of these ideas. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but if they're right, what are we going to do? WGD, what are we going to do about it? How do we put one foot in front of the other and try to recast these models and do our work differently in a way that is ennobling, inspiring, and tries to get us to remember the critical relationship between a healthy ecology at landscape level and a healthy community at the human level.
And do we have to attack it from a couple of different angles? First of all, we have to be able to talk about it knowledgeably ourselves. Bob Willard is always talking about, can we credibly talk about this new way of thinking? And then I see Chris and Lori are having a discussion about verbology, and how we turn things around in the kind of language that we use. I put a note in there, oftentimes we're amazed at how the marketers and the lobbyists can come in and get people excited because they're using emotional language rather than rational language. And really, as much as we think that humans are rational, if you talk to psychologists, no, emotion tends to lead the way for us. Loud wins.
Loud wins, and marketing is a significant problem. Chris talked about possibly the positive side of social marketing, but Lori adverted here, and Chris in his response, to the negative side of marketing. Creating fear is a very powerful tool, and you see it at the national level. When a government uses fear to mobilize people towards a cause that is problematic. Here in the U.S., we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the March to Washington in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. And politicians across the country use fear, including our own Federal Bureau of Investigation, to try to prevent the progress of civil rights. We've seen this in recent years in other contexts. And at the community level, I have seen a good example is our mass transit system. I grew up and went to high school in Marin County, which is a relatively affluent area to the north of San Francisco. When BART was being put in, one of the most effective cost-responsible mass transit systems in the country. The campaign in Marin County was about people from the East Bay having access to the North Bay. So what they meant by people from the East Bay was blacks. This is in 1972 and 3, that people were campaigning in a rich, largely white, affluent neighborhood to keep a really effective mass transit system out of Marin County because it would give people of color access to the community. And this tool of fear is so often used to derail effective community planning, and it sometimes creeps in accidentally. It's not always bad intentions. Just trying to track what Susan is saying here. Yeah, that's absolutely right. You have to meet people where they are Susan, which is another element of genius loci, talk the local language. When we do this work in communities in the American Southwest or up in the north of Alberta, and we work with First Nations, we have to use an entirely different language and approach. And that's true because Detroit is different to Toronto, is different to San Francisco. Well, you know, I mean, I think to me, a lot of this is about creating that feeling on a Sunday morning in a town when you're in the community garden, or when you're at the farmer's market, or when you're walking down the street and your neighbors, you know, are on their front lawn playing with their kids, and we remember what community is about. And this idea of resilience is gaining some ascendancy, some important work being done in Canada here. A really brilliant study, very recent, done out in the west of Canada. You know, this philosophical shift in relations between the state and civil society that changes the parameters of how local communities organize and act. I think this is a defining moment. We have a chance to shift the dialogue, to shift the mood. And, you know, I'll go to one of my favorites here, Aldo Leopold. You know, his reflections on this set of issues in the 30s and 40s is so profound. He talks about the fact that our ability to perceive quality in nature begins with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values and inspirational relationships with the land on which we live that cannot be captured by language. And that's the work. That's the work, to call people to these higher-minded ideas. The entomologist E.O. Wilson, in his book Consilience, says we need the freedom to roam across land owned by no one but protected by all, whose unchanging horizon is the same that bounded the world of our millennial ancestors. You know, this having these meetings out of doors, connecting to the land, this is all a set of ethical actions that can ennoble the process rather than have it. Oh, that's a great reference. Jane's walk there, really interesting approach to how we think about community planning. So we're in the home stretch here, and I want to introduce a little idea that occurred to me after trying to figure out how to get this stuff right. Some of you in Canada may know about the Inco mine controversy in the maritime provinces out there. In Newfoundland, Inco wanted to build a large nickel mine, and a very brilliant Canadian scholar, Robert Gibson, convened a community planning process to fundamentally shift this extractive activity. When I read about this, it occurred to me that our models of community development really need to shift, as well as our conception of sustainable development. So I started testing this idea of regenerative development. And this is the profession of faith towards regenerative development that they've used in the city of Fort Collins. And it is a profession of faith, and that may sound a bit religious, but it's really quite secular. But this work is sacred work, protecting the land and stewardship. The community and its citizens and leaders shall consider all undertakings and projects for approval by first determining how this undertaking or project will measurably, over the medium and long term, improve the social, economic, and ecological well-being of those who are affected. Easy to say, hard to do. And you know, I'm noticing Susan's making an interesting point. Sometimes you cannot use the S word. Sometimes you really just have to use the word well-being. But imagine companies that give back more to nature and community than they take. That's what we're trying to inspire here in the entrepreneurs we teach in our business program. Communities that measurably build character and increase quality of life. This is the challenge. This is the opportunity that we have. This is a picture from the German state of Bavaria, where we did some hopefully useful work around the issue of water resource management and community planning back in the early 2000s. You know, in our next webinar, our goal will be to use some cases and to reconceive macroeconomics to see how we can actually practice this reconception of community development. and look at this idea of scaffolding as a way of building a future that is inspiring and ennobling and deeply, deeply connected to the land. Because what's true is the law will never protect us. I speak as a land use and natural resources lawyer. Alva Leopold said in 1933 of the American West, which includes the west of Canada, that to live in real harmony with this land seems to require either a degree of public regulation, which we will not tolerate, or a degree of private enlightenment, which we do not possess. And one could argue we're still stuck in that model. I really love this idea. You know, community development discussions have a totally different tenor when you hold them in a community garden as opposed to a conference room. It's a really great notion. I'll let you look at this slide at your convenience. I want to be conscious of the time and leave plenty of time for closing discussion and challenges. I'm astonished, Catherine, that we're on time. I'm not sure what's going on here, some sort of bend in the space-time continuum. But next time we'll talk about this planning process and economics. A couple of cases, as I said, Fort Collins and a case from the American island or the U.S. island of Kauai, and trying to set the foundation for this online course that we're going to be doing to go deeper into this with a proper set of reading and exercises. Can anybody identify, not where this is, but what kind of building is this? Yeah, Suzanne. It's a church. It's a church in Kauai, in the community where we did this project that I'll describe in the next webinar. And we had a meeting there. And this is a very pagan kind of church. It's a church that is both sacred in the Western way of thinking about it, but it was built and serves the First Nations of Hawaii. And it's a very interesting mix of the traditional in the roof and the westernized in the building itself. And it goes back to this idea of genius loci and doing your work in a way that's consistent with the land on which you're planning, which means you don't go into conference rooms with flip charts in every city you go to in community development, which is why often I think we sometimes stumble and get this stuff wrong because we try to impose a standardized production model of community development in something that requires unique consideration of the land and the people in the place. I want to leave time. We've got 5 minutes here for discussion and challenges and other ideas, and I know that Catherine probably has some wrap-up comments. So I'm going to stop there and thank you all for the fabulous discussion in the chat box and the inquiry and interventions during the course of things. I hope this has been interesting and useful, and I'm happy to answer questions or respond to challenges.
I just love the language that you use in all of this, Ed. It just it is inspiring, I think. I don't know, you know, how have you found working with various communities? I think you've had lots of practice kind of explaining to people this new way of looking at things. What's really worked with you for you to get people to kind of reconfigure the way that they want to look at community planning?
Well, again, I want to go back to something I said at the beginning. A lot of this is derivative of the work that I've seen my colleagues and my amazing clients and the people that we've worked with use and do. But I mean, sometimes it's just down to effective, potent questions that grow out of the place where you're working. I remember we were doing a county-wide process in upstate New York when I stumbled across this little method of trying to extract common ground out of a deeply riven, very interest-based set of conflicts in the community in Tompkins County up in the Finger Lakes District. So I went back to something that E.O. Wilson talked about when he talked about our relationship to nature and the concept of conservation. And he said, we will be judged by what we choose not to destroy. And so I asked the community for the first time, and I've done this about a dozen times in communities around mostly North America since, what are the things that are most fundamental to this community that you're in the greatest danger of losing if we don't do things differently? What are the things that most matter to this community that if we don't do things better and more smart and differently, you're going to lose? And time after time, that question has people have a totally different discussion because everybody in the room is a parent or a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt They may also be a town councilor and a developer. They may be a banker and a baker, but they're all citizens. And so it's sometimes about these potent questions that create space for people to find common ground and have a different discussion that helps to inspire a shift, sometimes even a tectonic shift in how people approach these issues.
So how is that different than the negative things that we've been talking about here in terms of, you know, what we're against or what we're, you know, trying to avoid?
Well, it's interesting. If you ask a community, in theory and at a theoretical level, how do you want to use a piece of land? That is calculated to cause disputes. It's a zero-sum game kind of model. Instead of asking, what do we want our community to become? Not how do you want to use a piece of land. It's not about redeveloping State Street and Fort Collins. It's about asking the question, how safe will our children be as they try to commute on their bikes to work? That's the question. And often it's just that the law leads us to ask the wrong questions because we forget about community and who we're doing this work for. We're doing this work for the cherub-faced children in the room and with the responsibility of our ancestors looking over our shoulders. And if we were to think about those things, I think we quite often would take different decisions, make different remarks, and find more common ground. I would confess, Catherine, I'm sometimes without grammar. I get stuck in these things. I'm still trying to figure this out, as you all are. I don't claim any expertise, just a little bit of experience.
Suzanne was trying to unmute, but she's in a funny position. So she said that all of what you've said reaches all of us on a very visceral level. And this was the idea behind Justine Merritt's ribbon, naming what you can't live without. Once you've done that, all the arguments and rationalizations disappear.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay, well, thank you very much. As Ed has mentioned, we are going to do a follow-up session on September the 18th, and after the session, I'm going to send you a link on which you can just register directly for it. You won't have to register through the website. You'll be registering through WebEx. So if you want to do the follow-up session where Ed's going to talk about some case studies and the application of some of the things he's explained, then please feel free to do that. And that one's going to start at 1:15 in the afternoon on September the 18th, so you might want to mark that in your calendar. So it'll be from 1:15 until 2:15, so the timing is a little bit different. And thank you for completing the poll. And we look forward to having you back. As I said, we're going to do a more in-depth course where there's going to be some readings, and we're going to look at some of the work that Ed has talked about more specifically. And it's going to start on October the 16th. And we're going to get something up on the website about that because we think if we can all credibly speak to this and look at these things in a different way, we can help the citizens that we're trying to move in the right direction along a little bit better. Do you have any final comments, Ed?
Thanks. I would only say that if anybody wants to be in touch either by phone or by email in between now and the next webinar, and they have questions or things they'd like me to be sure to address that will be on the poll, I would welcome hearing from folks. And I just want to thank you, Catherine, and your center, and everybody for their time this morning. I hope it's been useful.
Terrific. And it's been a great group on a Wednesday in August. So thank you very much, and thank you for all your participation today. And we look forward to seeing you on the 18th. Thank you so much, everyone.